What's technology really done for us so far? Technology has allowed us to achieve greater levels of productivity. Right? If I go into a banking hall, then I would have seen hundreds of people writing accounting books back in the 1950s. Those jobs have been replaced by different forms of technology, and different aspects of clerical work, administrative work, has been replaced by these kind of technologies. It's not unusual now for us to fill in our insurance application form online or complete our tax return online, because that administrative work is now being given to you rather than somebody else, right? So that burden's being moved to you, but that becomes a standard part of life. But that's given productivity to the systems behind that. At the same time, we've also been able to increase the performance of systems and processes. So the time it takes us to do things, right? It used to take us months before we got a mortgage before. Now we're down to matters of days, right? And in some cases, you can get loans in minutes, right? You wouldn't imagine that was possible back in 20, 30 years ago. But now it's kind of commonplace. At the same time, the amount of data that we have allows us to start to predict outcomes and predict results at a level that we couldn't imagine. That data that exists, a lot of it we can't use today, but that data allows us to predict things that we couldn't do before. So these are the three primary outcomes that digitization has helped us achieve over the last 50, 70 years. Okay? And as we start to think about this, we start to say, well, are there some fundamental laws that are at play here? Are there things that are driving this that we haven't thought about? And I wrote this actually just at the beginning of the month, because it suddenly dawned on me, there are three fundamental laws that we don't think about in terms of digitization. The first thing is that whatever can be digitized will be digitized. Right? Somebody will find a way of doing it if it's possible. Okay? So that's a first premise. The second thing is, whatever gets digitized tends to free. Right? So the value from the thing that gets digitized diminishes over time, and we have to create value from something different. And whatever gets digitized, the data that is created from that digitization has an intrinsic kind of gravity type capability, and it attracts other data, other analysis, other algorithms to it. And it's that new data and new algorithms that create the new value. And it's almost like a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of things just continuing to evolve. And so these three laws, and this is just my view, this is just me kind of thinking out aloud, and I wrote a couple of blogs on this recently. These, I think, are fundamental to what's been happening over the last 10 years. We just haven't described them in that way. And I'd love your views on that. If you think this is just BS or this is interesting, we can talk about that separately. But so what's actually happening behind this? And as I go back to my own learning back in the early 90s, computing was all about taking data. So we took data and we applied science in the form of analysis or algorithms. And that analysis allowed us to create new information. And that information was the value. This is the magic of IT over the last 70 years or so, right? So you might say, yeah, okay. What do you mean by that? Okay, let's give you an example. Let's try to bring that to life. So if I take data, this is a camera on a tennis court, okay? This camera can digitize the image of what's going on that court. If we use some smart algorithms, through using some analysis in some computers, we can find new information. And the information is things like, how fast was that serve? Right? We knew Federer served at 147 miles per hour at that particular serve, right? Or we can start to say, was that ball in or out? Okay? That's all information that's derived from an image that's taken on the tennis court. Okay? Now, as I was going through that example, many of your minds was not necessarily listening to what I was talking about there. It was somewhere else. You were thinking about Wimbledon, right? Now that was why did I think about Wimbledon? Why did Wimbledon come out? Because those images conjured up the tennis competition that we all know about, which is Wimbledon. What you were doing is you were turning that information into a context. And what we've done over the last 70 years is give people more and more information and ask them to use their own knowledge, their own expertise to put that into a context and do something with it. Okay? Now, what's happening with the new technologies like artificial intelligence, deep machine learning, is we can create a new set of equations. So the equation that we've had, which is data plus analysis gives us information, is still there. But there's a new equation now because we can put information into a new class of technology called context systems, and we can create new insights. Okay? Now, that in itself doesn't help us create value. What actually happens is that insight causes somebody to act, and that creates an outcome. And it's the action that creates the value. It's the outcome that you pay for. Okay? So that action may be, I know what the normal operating boundaries are for temperature in a building. If it goes outside those boundaries, that's a context that I worry about. And so I may need to switch up the air conditioning or switch on the heating or have some kind of action. And that in itself can create some kind of value. It's a very simple example. Let's get more sophisticated. Let's look at traveling from A to B. If I look at the journey time between A and B, there may be all kinds of problems on that journey. That context helps us take more sophisticated decisions on how to best optimize that journey. Okay? So what's happening right now, the battleground right now, is this new context-based systems. And so when you look at things like DeepMind and Watson and all those technologies, they're trying to create new context. They're trying to use the data that we've been capturing and the analysis and information that we've had in the past, put it into a context and create new insights. And that new insight allows us to do some new things. Yeah, so the action that somebody takes is based on experience, knowledge, or expertise. And we'll come back to that later on. Because we're not replacing people with this, right? There's a big fear that all of a sudden robots are going to do everything we do, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're actually augmenting what people do. And by augmenting it through this context, that knowledge is more sophisticated. Right? And often the question is, so what's the role of people in this thing? And the role of people is not necessarily to have the answers, but to be able to ask the right questions. And you can only ask the right questions if you have the knowledge and experience beforehand. So knowledge and experience becomes much more valuable than necessarily knowing the data and the answers. Okay. So as part of this, you've got to think about, what am I trying to do? What's kind of outcome I'm trying to create? And often we start to think about startups and disruptors, and they're reimagining the world, right? There's a lot of those, and there's this tremendous amount of work going on there. At the same time, there are also some well-established players, and we can think of them as lions, right? And they're seeing a bunch of startups coming after them and trying to attack them. So a bunch of hyenas, if you get enough hyenas together, they will absolutely kill the lion. No doubt about it, right? But you need enough of them together. And the lion needs to decide whether he's going to stay on his own or he's going to have a pack of lions to go and attack these hyenas. So this is a battle that we see going on. And startups, the thing about digitization, because it tends to create things in a very simple and almost free way, and has an almost infinite scale because of things like internet and so on, we're able to have impact through very small investments to start with, and that creates tremendous disruption. So the disruptors, a small person can be very effective like a shark, really disrupting the marketplace very quickly, right? So then when you start to think inside a corporation or an established institution, you have to think about this as an innovation journey on steroids, really. And so when you start to think about the innovation journey, this is about saying, firstly, innovation has got to create a level of discomfort. Right? People will be in a position where they feel comfortable. Right? That might not be the perfect position, but that's where they feel comfortable. You've got to create a level of discomfort, and then you've got to create a journey. And often, we can't see the end point of that journey. Right? We might see that bridge, and we can see the fog. Beyond the fog, we've got no idea whether there's axe murderers there about to kill us, or whether there's a fantastic ravine that's going to open up. It's going to be a beautiful paradise. We don't know. Right? Part of the innovation journey is create sufficient discomfort in the current position, but create a vision with enough clarity that people will come with you on that journey. And that in itself is the challenge that we face. So let me try and bring this story to life, and I'm going to give you an example, okay? So how many of you are familiar with the big freight trains that go from east to west coast in the US? The big, massive trains. You seen those things? Yeah? What do you think is the biggest problem with those freight trains? The biggest challenge that they face? Any idea?
Reliability.
Reliability, close. So, Uncertainty? Maybe.
Breakdown.
Breakdown. So what's the biggest cause of breakdowns? Because when one of those things stops and you have a breakdown, it's a real problem.
Mechanical failure.
Mechanical failure? Close.
Wear and tear of mechanical systems.
Much closer. Cracked wheels. The biggest problem on those things is they go through such a large number of terrains that they get cracked wheels. Temperature terrains, the weights and pressures that they have, but different loads. So they're going thousands of miles, and the stresses create cracked wheels. A cracked wheel does what? It potentially creates derailment, destroys the track, potentially kills people. So the question is, what do we do about this? How do we apply this thinking to that problem of cracked wheels? So what we did is actually put a little microphone on the carriages. And the microphone, through machine learning, could distinguish between the background noise from the train, the wind noise, the engine noise, and the unique sound signature of the wheel. And we could pick out the sound signature and we could say, is that a solid wheel or is that wheel about to crack? And if it's about to crack, we could get a message back to the driver to say, stop, your wheel's about to crack. It's one of the wheels on carriage X, and he can go test them. Right. Before that, anybody know what they used to do before that? They actually had a man with a hammer who would go along and tap every single wheel and listen to the sound of the wheel. And based on the sound of the wheel, he could tell whether it was good enough to travel thousands of miles. Now, that's a pretty precise job. And actually, it was interesting because it was often piano tuners who wanted to transition from piano tuning because their ear wasn't good enough to do the piano tuning to being a wheel tapper. So we just destroyed a profession, but that's a real story, right? So that's an example of data, new data in the form of microphone, put into a context which is about the whole train, the train journey, where it's at, and then starting to use that to create an outcome, which is to stop something that happens. Now, we started to look at the society and we said, well, okay, how can I apply that to the world? So we did some work with various economists, and we found most processes that we rely on have huge amounts of inefficiency. And the most inefficiency actually sits in healthcare today. So as you look at each one of the processes, there's a paper which we published, and you can look at the level of optimization you can do by applying these kind of techniques to each one of those processes. And when we added it up globally, there's $4 trillion could be saved from societally GDP by applying these kind of techniques. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in that. But let's think about what's possible. Let's think about the world that we could have going forward, right? Let's think about the world of crime to start with. So it's a bit of a jokey video, but the reality is that we're using these kind of techniques to actually analyze data from society. In the US, we were able to reduce, in New York, the amount of crime by 70% by predicting where crime would take place. By taking social media data, taking established crime data, and taking data from all the different departments in the crime prevention, combining the data to spot those patterns and seeing those new things. And the context was the social media data. And it's staggering what people will put on social media if only you could read what they were saying. And that's what some of these technologies are doing. We've got a whole bunch of other things. So let's think about ball bearings. I mean, you think about ball bearing and you think, well, what's that got to do with this? Well, this is probably the most important sensor we have in any machinery. Most machines have ball bearings. If I'm able to take each one of those little balls and put a small piece of magnetism on that ball, and I can watch through sensors attached to that housing how fast those ball bearings are turning, all of a sudden I've got a sensor on the speed of the bearing, the speed of the machine. I can look at the quality of the bearing based on microphones attached to the housing, so we can look at the vibrations. I can put a temperature sensor on there. I can even put a piezoelectric cell which projects light onto there, and then a sensor to see what the quality of the oil is around the bearing. Right? All of those are possible, and we're using those kind of technologies to go and monitor out remote turbines to see the health of machinery. Right? Now that gives us tremendous opportunities. Then let's think about something different. So let's think about fraud. When I went to go and see this company, they showed me one of these bearings and said, here's a real bearing that we've made, and here's another bearing that somebody else made. Tell me what the difference is. I couldn't tell the difference. They said the difference is one will last 5 years without any problems, one will last 3 months. The quality of the alloy, we can't see the difference. The reality is that quality of alloy is very, very different, and its lifetime is very different. Now, what we need to be able to do is spot issues in our system. A big part of the issues that we have is fraud. So let's think about fraud. So very simple things, just like having a register of every single component that's manufactured, you can look at where that component is going through the manufacturing cycle and be able to pick out just from the barcode whether it's an authentic one or a dud device. We put RFIDs on most things so we can track them. And we can track it right the way through the manufacturing cycle through the point where it gets to the end consumer. And we could start to use that data in new ways. And we are using that data to pick out potential frauds. Just to give you a feeling, the ball bearing industry in 2012, the amount of fraud in Europe alone was 5 billion euros. Right? That's the amount of wastage we have because of counterfeit bearings coming into the system, just in the ball bearing industry. And you can imagine other industries where that exists. But let's think about banking, right? So how does this apply in the banking space? We've done a lot to banking already. But in the banking space, we need to start to think differently because the expectation of people is very, very different. We need to understand people in very different ways. And what we start to think about is how do we use context-type technologies to start to really understand what matters to people? It's about competitions, okay? So it's a great example here. ASB Bank in New Zealand, they created a competition. And the competition was called Like a Loan, right? You write that heart-wrenching story of why this loan is important to you. And you post it on Facebook and connect it with ASB Bank. The more likes you get, the person gets the highest rating. The person with the most likes at the end of the month for their story gets a free loan. Now, for them, that was a way of getting 300,000 stories of why loans matter to people. You would never have got that amount of insight on what mattered to people without doing these kind of competitions. Taking that gold mine of data and putting it into machine learning tools, you can start to create all kinds of new insights of people and what matters to people. One of the biggest issues that we have to worry about is the ethical and privacy angle, right? Because you'll have probably all heard this story of Target and how Target were able to predict a teenager as pregnant before the father did, causing tremendous uproar in the press a few years ago. And they could, because they watched the buying patterns of that particular individual, they could very quickly see that she was pregnant and sent her a pregnancy kit at home. Right? Now, was it appropriate that Target did that? That's a question we've all got to ask. We don't have necessarily the right answer. But the fact is that the predictability we can get from data is phenomenal, right? And that's because of the digital shadow that we're all leaving around the world. I'll give you another example. There's an app that we wrote called Tweet Me Watson. If we take 300 of your tweets or Facebook status updates, we can create a psychometric profile for an individual. This is actually a psychometric profile for an individual that I knew, a chief exec of a particular organization. And I was going to go meet her. I created this profile, and I sent it to her and said, this is what you're saying through your tweet messages. The accuracy of the psychometric profile, when I assessed it with 100 of our technical leaders, was about between 80 and 90% compared to them doing a 2-hour psychometric profile test. Right? And that was simply by taking their profile. We can take that kind of insight and start to tune the messaging that we can give to any one individual. We can target the language, we can target almost any aspect of the interaction between you and a computer system, right? And the more data we get, the more sophisticated we're getting by this, okay? So this is the kind of reality that digitization is creating. The whole journey here is just trying to understand some of those patterns, because unless you understand the patterns, understand what's really happening, what is the action that you've taken, you've effectively created fraudulent data or incorrect data to game the system. How do we get past that? How do we understand some of those things? How do we connect to other things? And so as you start to bring the big picture back and say, okay, individual behavior will be different. But what's happening at the business level, the corporate level, and how does this digitization transform at the business level? And that's a big part of what I've been trying to do. How do I understand what's going to happen at a big business level? And what we published a couple of years back was 5 patterns. And what we're seeing is these are the primary 5 atomic patterns for how disruption takes place, right? So if I'm a manufacturer of products, as my product leaves the factory gates, I lose contact with that product. By augmenting that product with sensors and technology and different types of connectivity, I can turn that product into a service, right? So think about connected cars, think about smart TVs or connected appliances. That's all the manufacturing industries are chasing that particular pattern. The second pattern says anything that's done by people in a service type industry is gradually being coded into some form of software, and their value is being eroded into being an API in the cloud. And so over time, we're seeing this gradual conversion of different forms of manual activity into a service in the cloud. And you can see a bunch of those APIs out there. The third pattern says legal structures and organizational structures create intrinsic boundaries. So any value chain spans multiple organization boundaries, and they create inefficiencies. And by combining the data across those value chains, we're able to optimize the value chain and take the inefficiency out of the value chains. Healthcare is classic example there. The value chain for healthcare is very complex, got very many players, and that has huge amounts of inefficiency because of that. The fourth pattern says anything I do to run the business and I create data, that data can become a tradable asset, and that becomes value I can trade along with others. And the final thing says if I digitize or create a digital representation of any physical asset, I can use that digital representation to create new interaction patterns and create new value. And those 5 atomic patterns are ones that we documented back in 2014. And I've had many people come back and say, I've got a 6th pattern. And so far, nobody's been able to find anything different from these. We can break those patterns into one of those 5. And there's a HBR paper you want to read about it. But they describe the kind of 5 ways that we see society evolving. But then you're into the question, okay, that's all great. But what's it mean for people and individuals? Okay, so what's the role of people as this transformation happens? And yes, the traditional roles of CEO and all those kind of things will still exist, but there are some new intrinsic skills and capabilities that are starting to emerge. And I describe them as 5 animals. The first thing is we've got to think about how we gather the data. The squirrels are the modern day librarians who go and gather new forms of data and innovate the whole data capture aspect. They worry about new types of sensors, they worry about pools of data, they hoard data. Okay? The owls are the visionaries. They start to sit above the data and understand the kind of outcomes that we can create from the data and the big value that we can create from the data. The foxes or the wolves are the cunning ones. They're the algorithmic geeks. They're kind of the real data scientists. They worry about how we can take this data and create these magical algorithms which create brand new insights from that data. The weaver birds are the small birds that really build the sophisticated nest. They worry about engineering these solutions, these new cloud-based, data-based applications which become intrinsically robust and reliable for the future. And then the last part is the hawks who fly above and they worry about the ethics and privacy and legality. They try and avoid the kind of situation that Target got themselves into by doing things that are inappropriate. And so these 5 kind of characteristics, if you like, make up what we think is the kind of data savvy culture that we see coming forward. And this culture and these kind of capabilities aren't outside the existing professions. We see the professions being transformed by these kind of capabilities. So they're not instead of, they're as well as. So you still need to have deep expertise in your profession, but you need to have these as foundational skills and capabilities to survive going forward. Yeah, so I've done quite a bit of work with a number of organizations, and often you get these 2 straddled. You often get the theorists, the gatherers and the engineers straddled. You sometimes get these 3 in one individual. You very rarely get the righteous with any of the others. Funnily enough. So I've done it's probably about 30 or so projects with large corporates I've been reviewing on this basis. What's interesting is all the projects that they've seen failing, there's been one of these missing. They've not had that competency, and that's for me, that's the most interesting thing. But the trick is you need to understand some of this stuff, otherwise you're not going to be successful, right? Because ultimately it's about where does this new value come from? And what you start to realize is the new value is not where it used to be. The new value is creating unique, magical experiences at a scale and a consistency which makes everybody feel unique. That's where we're heading. Right? I don't know how many of you read things like Sapiens and Homo Deus, which I've just finished reading. Homo Deus provides a very different, Jarl in his book, he presents a very different view of where we might go. He's talking about immortality as a dream, and that's where mankind takes us. There's lots of big thinkers who are painting very big, scary pictures, and science fiction paints very big, scary pictures, and that's what kind of drives us towards a particular behavior. But what's actually coming through is money comes from individual experiences, because we still trade on money as our primary value instrument. We haven't shifted from that. Now, will we shift from that? That's a big question. That's a big societal question. We don't have answers to that. If we shift from money to something else, I mean, you look at something like In Time as a movie a couple of years ago where they said get paid on money. We don't get paid on money, you get paid on how many hours you got left to live. And there's a little clock on your arm which tells you how many hours to live, and you go and work to get another hour or another few hours to live. Are we going to get to that kind of scenario? Maybe. A long way from it. So as you start to think about this, and I kind of close here, we see new kind of work emerging. We refer to that as new collar work. And the new collar work starts to bring outcome-led behaviors, starts to look at how we make predictability out of unpredictability, and we start to create new kind of business models. Traditional business models will start to erode, and we talk about the 5 patterns that might transform that. There's new kind of working practices, thinking in an agile way, very disruptive kind of startup type mentality. And it doesn't matter whether it's a corporate, whether it's a 700-year-old institution or a 6-week-old institution. These kind of behaviors we see across all of these. Very data savvy, very evidence driven, very creative. And the new values, so as you start to look at people and what people care about, these new values start to become much more prevalent. They want meaningful work. They want to have the right progress, and they want to have the right metrics. That's what we hear time and time again as we go through these discussions. People want this digitization journey to help create much greater meaning in their work, in their daily life. They want to do things that feel right and actually have some humanity, humanitarian impact, if you like. And they want to do things which are measured in the right way. The metrics that we create are too blunt and too imprecise. They want more precision and accuracy around those metrics. And that's what we're hearing time and time again. So
what do you mean with that last point?
So it's like if I take education, for example, the schooling system, we've all started chasing the best A-level grades. Is it just the best A-level grades, or is it creating curious young people who will transform the world, right? So what are the right metrics? Are we thinking about the right metrics? Okay. So I hope that gives you some perspectives. You were interactive. I was hoping some more challenge, but I hope that's been useful. Stefano.
Thank you very much, Rashik.